about crime a lot as a little kid. When I was 8 years old, a little girl named Polly Klaas was kidnapped not far from where I lived in California. She was taken out of her bedroom window and later found murdered. The man who committed this terrible crime was a repeat offender. People said if only he was still in prison, serving time for his previous offense, this never would have happened. So, people started calling for longer prison sentences. In fact, Polly's murder became the primary motivation for California voters to pass the nation's harshest three-strikes law. Under this law, people who had previously committed a felony could go to prison for 25 years or life when they committed a new crime. I think this whole thing had a big impact on me because around the same time, I don't remember exactly when, I started doing something rather strange. I was raised Catholic, so I'd say prayers every night. Laying in bed with my eyes closed and hands folded on my chest, I would ask God to bless my parents and siblings, to help make me a good person, and to please make sure all the bad people go to prison. Looking back at this habit, a good 25 years later, I can't help but think it's a little strange that as a child, I prayed for people to go to prison. I really thought about crime a lot. Maybe that's why I decided to study criminal punishment in college. And maybe that's why, now that I'm a college professor, I spend my time studying prisons throughout history. Basically, I go to archives to study diaries, letters, newspapers, and records from old prisons. I'm kind of like a less adventurous version of Indiana Jones. Now, as someone who studies prisons for a living, I look back at 8-year-old me and wonder, how had I already decided that prison is the appropriate punishment for serious crime? How does that happen? How did sending people to prison become so normal? How did we as a society decide that incarceration is the correct punishment? For a lot of people, sending someone to prison just seems like the natural thing to do. It's what we've always done, right? Sure, at various times we've tortured and killed people for committing crime, but we've always had prisons around for average criminals, right? That's certainly what I thought for a long time. But it turns out that's not exactly right. Prisons are actually a pretty new development in human history. They only emerged about 230 years ago, around the time of the American and French Revolutions. They popped up first in the new United States, then in England, and then in other places like Canada and France. People are usually surprised by this. I was surprised by this the first time I found out. That's because we've all seen movies or read stories about olden times with people kept in some sort of confinement. Like, if you saw the movie The Pirates of the Caribbean, there are several scenes with people kept in a sort of cage. You know, like the one with the dog. The dog has the keys in his mouth and the men have a bone and they're trying to get the dog to bring them the keys so they can break out. The men look like they're starving, their clothing is in tatters, and they're behind bars. Johnny Depp is also in there because he's a pirate, a criminal. But that's not a prison. Now, when I say a prison, I mean a place where we punish convicted offenders for long-term confinement. What we're seeing in movies are actually what we would call jails. So what's the difference between a jail and a prison? A jail is actually a holding tank, not a place of punishment. It contained a mix of people, not just convicted criminals, not even just criminals. And it usually kept people for short periods of time, days, maybe weeks. This is what an English jail looked like in the mid-1700s. Now, as awful as places like this were, they weren't considered places of punishment, nor were they just for criminals. Instead, they contained quite a mix of people, including debtors, vagrants, accused criminals, convicted criminals, and even sometimes witnesses held over for trial. And they were all kept together in one big room, criminals and non-criminals alike. And they were all kept there for different reasons. Debtors would stay in jail until they had paid back their debt. Accused criminals would stay in jail until they had been tried in court. In those days, court was held 4 times a year, so they might have to wait up to 3 months for their trial. Convicted criminals might be punished right away, but then go back to the jail so that they could pay back their court fees and fines. In each of these cases, staying in jail wasn't supposed to be a punishment, but just a way to keep track of people temporarily. So they tended to stay for short periods, days, weeks, maybe months. So if jails weren't considered places of punishment, and they weren't just for convicted criminals, what was? This is what punishment looked like. Capital punishment was the dominant, although not the most common, form of punishment at the time. Executions were public, and typically the whole town turned out to see somebody get hanged, or in some cases burned, boiled, drowned, or stoned. Death wasn't just a serious punishment, it was a painful one as well. Other punishments were also public and painful. These included whipping, cutting off an ear, getting branded in the cheek or in the hand. This was one of the most mild punishments at the time. People would be sentenced to spend a few hours or maybe a day in these wooden devices called the pillory. Crowds would come out to mock and jeer the people, or maybe throw rotten food and rocks at them. So how did we go from these to this? Around the time of the American Revolution, things started to change. In England, other European countries, Canada, and the United States, a growing number of people found public, painful punishments distasteful. Others were worried that these public, painful punishments didn't scare people enough. People picking pockets in the crowd of an execution was pretty good evidence that the current punishments didn't deter. Others were worried, or others turned their attention to the jails. Jails were overcrowded, disease-infested, violent places, and some people had a problem with that. It was in this context that penal reformers and political theorists began discussing alternatives to this criminal justice system, such as it was, and they came up with the prison, a new facility designed to punish convicted criminals with long-term confinement. What I find interesting about the rise of the prison is it was extremely controversial, especially in England and the new United States. No one knew how the prison would work in reality. Some people were worried about the expense. Prisons were, and continue to be, extremely expensive undertakings. Scaffolds and pillars were pretty cheap and easy to build. Likewise, jails were just typical buildings, nothing fancy. But prisons, big stone edifices capable of holding 200 or maybe 500 people, were extremely expensive undertakings, and they took several years to build. They also needed a full staff to run them. Prison wardens and superintendents usually supervised a staff of about a dozen or so guards, each of whom needed to be paid. By contrast, jailers in the old days would be paid by the prisoners themselves who paid room and board. Aside from the expense, the other big concern people had was whether prisons would be sufficiently humane. No one knew how people would react in captivity, so penal reformers and legislators endlessly discussed what would happen when you put a human being in captivity. Finally, a lot of people were nervous about whether the new prisons would actually help to reduce crime. At the time, people believed crime was caused by your environment, especially the negative influence of criminal types, including potentially your family and friends. So the new prisons were designed to limit prisoners' contact with the outside world. But they also didn't want the prisoners to interact with each other. So one strategy involved forbidding prisoners from talking with one another, and then whipping them if they did talk. Another strategy involved putting prisoners in solitary confinement, basically in a cell by themselves for the entire time. So even before the first prisons opened, people were nervous about their expense, about their humanity, and about their ability to reduce crime. But what really got people nervous was when they started trying to put these ideas into action. A lot of the first prisons failed miserably. For example, New York's first state prison experienced a series of riots in the 1810s. The prison was declared a failure, and the state legislature authorized a new prison to take its place. Auburn State Prison would be bigger, stronger, and more tightly controlled than its predecessor. In fact, some of its prisoners, the hardest and most atrocious offenders in the language of the time, would be kept in solitary confinement for their entire prison sentence, in cells that were, by the way, about 1 meter wide, so about this big. When Auburn opened in the early 1820s, these prisoners kept in solitary confinement immediately experienced mental and physical health problems, including muscle atrophy, disease, and a mental condition called decompensation. Basically, people were going insane. Some mutilated their bodies, others attempted suicide, and some died. After a few years, officials called an end to this experiment. As word leaked out, policymakers around the country declared this type of solitary confinement unacceptable. Something that I find interesting about this story, while policymakers decided this type of solitary confinement was unacceptable, they didn't think putting people in prison was a problem. Because it turns out, even outside of this type of solitary confinement, people die and go crazy in prisons. It's definitely worse when they're in solitary confinement the whole time. But prisons are a pretty harsh environment, and people don't tend to do well there. The other thing I find interesting about this story is while they decided that solitary confinement of this type was unacceptable, they still believed that solitary confinement of some kind was necessary for the prison to function. So in New York, the officials at Auburn State Prison came up with a new approach. Prisoners there would still spend their time in solitary confinement at night, but during the day, they would work together silently in large factory-like rooms. Likewise, Pennsylvanians decided solitary confinement was safe if you took appropriate precautions to protect prisoners' health. So prisoners at Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary spent their entire prison sentence in solitary confinement, in rooms that were pretty big. They would also receive weekly visits from penal reformers and prison administrators who would teach the prisoners how to read and write, and also give them mentorship, whether the prisoners wanted it or not. During the day, the prisoners would also exercise their mind and body by working within their cells, making shoes, chairs, and cabinets. Finally, they had access to a small private yard where they could exercise, the only time they would leave their cell. These two models, the Auburn approach and the Pennsylvania approach, were copied around the country. So pretty much every state that had a prison continued to use solitary confinement of some kind. However, the early failures with the prisons, especially the experiment with total solitary confinement, left a lasting impression on people's minds. Prisons became the subject of intense scrutiny. People kept expecting that the prison would fail, like it had already failed so many times at this point. In fact, the prison was heavily criticized, but not all prisons. People mostly focused their criticism on Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary, the one that kept its prisoners in solitary confinement around the clock. Most famously, English author Charles Dickens was horrified when he visited that prison. In a book about his travels to America, he criticized Eastern for, among other things, imposing on its prisoners an anguish so acute and so tremendous that all imagination of it must fall far short of the reality. He was sure Eastern's prisoners were slowly going insane, and if they weren't, they were certainly being tortured. However, Dickens thought the Auburn approach was great. Like others at the time, he focused his energy or his attention on the approaches to incarceration, not on the practice of putting people in prison. In fact, people continued to die and go crazy in all prisons, which, by the way, were pretty expensive, and crime rates didn't magically decline. But there were no more repeats of the Auburn disaster, so in that sense, the prison was a success. Over time, when new failures happened, people always blamed the approach to incarceration, or maybe the people who ran the prison, but never the prison itself. They always focused on fixing the prison's worst parts and ignored the prison's other bad parts. So over time, the prison stuck around. And that early anxiety about what would happen when we put people in prison for long periods of time went away. When I was growing up and praying for bad people to go to prison, we as a society had come a long way from those early days. The days when policymakers and prison administrators were fretting so openly about what happens when you lock people up for long periods of time. When I was starting high school, the United States was sending so many people to prison that we had reached historically unprecedented incarceration rates. When I went to graduate school 8 years later, we were locking up 1 in 100 adults. But what has been remarkable about this development, what people are talking about, is not the fact that we send people to prison, but how often we do it. We've gotten so used to sending people to prison. Even when something really bad happens in a prison, we talk about fixing prisons and prison policies, but not asking if we should still have prisons. As a society, we stopped asking that question a long time ago. And in thinking about that early period, I find it puzzling how quickly people got over their early fears about sending people to prison, and how, when those fears reappeared, the answer was always to fix the prison and not to get rid of it. Now that people are talking about penal reform again in Canada, the United States, and other countries, should we do what we've done so many times before and keep trying to fix the prison? Or is it time that we did something else? Thank you.